Hello, thank you for coming for the presentation. Today I present the impact of the emotional engagement on podcast review. I just finished my PhD at the Auckland University, and I started to teach the artificial intelligence and business management at the Cyber University of Korea next year. So do you like podcast? I like podcast to listen. For me, radio, book club, and many people nowadays they listen to podcast like a radio, and so I have a wonder which emotional content of the podcast actually enhance the engagement of this podcast. So this paper submitted to the Psychology and Marketing Journal, and now in the review on the review. So why does this engagement matter for podcast? We analyzed the data set which contain more than 100,000 Apple podcast episodes with the over 2 million reviews. Of that, only 3% of podcast episodes have at least 100 reviews. Yeah, so 97% podcast episodes have less than 100 reviews. In contrast, the rating from the 1 to 5, almost 80% of the podcast episode got a perfect 5 score, so which is very contrast. So which emotional content affect this different outcome? The previous research, they argue that the emotion actually enhance the engagement of the podcast, but they simply argue that the positive emotion, like joy, can enhance the engagement, whereas the negative emotion actually decrease the engagement. But is that really true? Only the joy is important? That's our question. Another previous research, they argue that the actually mixed emotion is important for podcast engagement. So, for example, one of the previous research argued that the combination of the joy and the sadness actually can increase the engagement of the podcast. So we wanted to investigate more about which emotion actually can increase the engagement. On top of that, we wanted to divide the podcast type, Utilitarian and Hedonic podcast episode. So Utilitarian podcast episode can provide valuable information or educational content, whereas the Hedonic podcast offer entertainment and emotional experience. So the aim of the research is these two research questions. This question 1, how does the mix of the emotion evoked by podcast influence the consumer's engagement with podcast? The second research question is more investigated deeply, so we will see the difference between utilitarian and hedonic podcast. Also, we wanted to investigate one more thing, method thing, how we can detect emotion in the podcast review. This is our conceptual model. So first, we wanted to detect emotion in the podcast review and see the effect on the engagement, number of review, and favorability to the review rating. Also, the research question 2, we will divide this effect by the utilitarian and hedonic podcast. So to investigate the emotion on the podcast review, we can see these two different things, sentiment analysis or specific emotion analysis. Sentiment analysis means divided this content into the negative or positive. But this too simple to divide just positive and negative human emotion is too simple to detect the full, the diverse human emotion. So we adapt the Ekman's 6 basic emotion theory that has we have more diverse emotion than just sentiment, like a fear, anger, sad, or disgust. We adopt transformer model, which is used to the ChatGPT to understand the emotion on the podcast review. The base transformer model is the BERT. BERT actually trained 8 million online word sentence using the self-attention mechanism to understand which word is more close to other word, to understand the human language. The upgraded version of the Roberta actually trained 10 times more text dataset than BERT, and have improved accuracy. The fun fact is that to see the traditional neural networking is the number of neuron is quite similar to the simple one, whereas the Roberta model quite similar to the syslog. Yeah, syslog is not quite high intelligent animal, but this living creature actually use their neuron to the mobility function, whereas the transformer model only use their neuron to analyze the human natural language. So we fine-tune meaning training the Roberta for specific emotion detection function. So we first collected 6 different hashtag emotion from the Twitter, and also 10 other emotion data set. So we trained our Roberta model with over 3 million sentence self-reported emotion data set, and then trained again with 60,000 sentence from the annotator-rated emotion data set. So this training Roberta model actually can outperform the traditional machine learning algorithm. Yes, when we analyzed it, we found that actually our model outperformed these 8 different traditional machine learning algorithm. And our model actually achieved 84% accuracy to detect human emotion in the text. Okay, then the analysis and the result. Again, we used the dataset got from the Kaggle, which contain over 2 million review, about 100,000 Apple Podcast episode, and posted from 2005 to 2023. And we divided this podcast episode, which contain more than 100 review or not, and also got a 5 perfect score or not, to run the logistic regression. So when we used our TTL emotion detection model to detect emotion from the podcast review, actually we found that joy is most dominant emotion, about 90%, following the small anger, disgust, fear, sadness, and surprise. So we decided to exclude the dominant emotion of joy, because that has a multi-collinearity issue to run the logistic regression. So we only run the other emotion, these mixed emotion. This is the result, first result about research question 1. Overall effect number of review and rating to the podcast episode. So as you can see, to the engagement, you can see this emotion actually has the positive effect, but this quadratic term, for example, anger times anger, disgust times disgust, has a negative effect. But favorability, you can see the opposite result. The emotion has a negative effect, whereas the quadratic emotion has a positive effect. It tells that the use of this secondary, the mixed emotion, actually increase number of review, but not too much. Second, we investigated the research question 2, effect on rating by Utilitarian and Hedonic. In this case, we found that when we divided by Utilitarian and Hedonic, there is some different values, but the trend is almost the same. Yeah. But when you see the effect on the number of review, Utilitarian and Hedonic, the trend is very similar, but when we deeply analyze with the tree analysis, we found that optimal range of this emotion. And we found that the Utilitarian has actually the narrow emotion range, whereas the Hedonic episode has a more wider emotion range to achieve a high number of the review. So the number is too complicated. I show the graph. So first, the impact of the emotion on the podcast rating is very simple. The more mixed emotion, like anger, disgust, fear, sadness, and surprise, means lower rating. Yeah, very simple. So to achieve a perfect rating, to minimize the negative emotion. But this one is interesting. To achieve a high number of the review, then we need a moderate mixed emotion. Means that so moderate level of this emotion actually increase the number of the review. So maybe we can think that it's this mixed negative emotion like a salt. When you make a delicious food, we need some small amount of the salt. So this negative emotion actually play like a salt in the food. So make the podcast episode more interesting or more attractive. So people are likely to hear this podcast episode. So we conclude that digital content creator face a key trade-off. Maximizing audience reaction, like a number of review, actually can reduce favorability, especially when content evoke negative emotion. Thank you very much. So this is our analysis of the podcast review. Do you have any question? I'm happy to answer it. Thank you. Yeah, we saw the, you mean the category? Yeah, we divided podcast by the category. So we divided, for example, we divided the education or politics and to the utilitarian podcast, whereas the gardening or the crime, these podcasts category comedy categorized to the hedonic podcast category. Yeah, recorded. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
based on the category. Yeah, thank you.
Any question?
You mentioned that you categorize, like for example, gardening and true crime podcast, all into the hedonic category.
Yeah.
But I feel like gardening and true crime podcasts would evoke a very different set of emotions. And do you think that kind of plays a role when you come to analyze the ideal range of emotions that should be evoked by whatever podcasts you listen to?
Definitely, yeah. For example, the true crime actually evoked anger or disgust, whereas gardening more likely evoked the surprise or something else emotion. But this, so we make an average of the hedonic episode to compare the utilitarian episode. And then we found that actually this hedonic episode, they evoked a wide range of the emotion, and that helped to increase the number of the reviews.
And that wasn't the case with utilitarian podcasts?
Yeah, utilitarian has very narrow the emotion range to evoke the high number of reviews.
Okay.
You excluded the emotion, the positive emotion, joy, right? I understand that there was a potential bias for the analysis or
Yeah.
statistical perspective. However, what do you think about the impact of joy in your model?
Joy has actually, I believe Joy play a huge role to affect the result, but still when we analyzed only the small number of the negative review, we found that R-square value is almost 30%. That means the more than 10% is higher to detect the human behavior in social science. So I believe 30% is quite high to explain the consumer behavior to listen their podcast.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.